Hi, for Cybersecurity Studios near Washington, D.C., I'm Dave Gardy for this special presentation, this hybrid web conference and webcast, CMC Impact on GovCon Part 2. Now, this was originally a live event in person that then became an event that was partially here, going to be shot in our studio and remote, and then now it's all remote with participants coming in via Zoom conference. And we're having issues with congestion on the East Coast. Both Zoom and Skype are somewhat stuttering, which is why my motions and video isn't as smooth, but we think our audio is coming through, so we're going to go ahead with this. Again, we have a conference here of several panels that's on the Zoom conference, and we're taking that stream and sending that out to the 800 or so people that have signed up to watch the stream on a separate webcast. They don't have direct interactivity like the panelists do, but they will have the ability to send in questions, and we will try to take as many questions as we can. But if we don't get to all of them, we'll make sure the presenters get the questions. And that's the existing housekeeping for today, just so you know what's going on. We have 4 panels. The first panel, CMMC, A Legal Lay of the Land, from 11 to 11:45. From 11:50 to 12:30 is Updates from the Front Line, CMCC briefing with Katie Arrington. And then from 12:35 to 1:15, the industry panel, Industry Update, Acquisition and Implementation, a panel hosted by Terry Roberts. And finally, the CMMC AB, Where Are We with These Things? And of course, that's the board that's going to determine the accreditation. And that's going to be hosted by, moderated by Eric Crucis. And we're going to go to Eric right now because he's the first panelist. But just want to let you know the entire webcast will discuss today the inherent issues of implementing the program with COVID-19, a timeline of what to expect with updates, industry perspective and shifting priorities related to security, updates and developments from the CMCC, accreditation body CMMC AB. Got a lot of C's in there. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Eric. Again, we're experiencing on the East Coast, especially Zoom and Skype, which we tried. We were going to try that. It's not any better. So please bear with us. And we're going to hope the audio comes through. We're getting feedback on our tech support line. If you have support issues, there's a support link underneath the video player on the lower left side. From that point on, I guess I'm going to send it over to Eric for the first panel, Legal Lay of the Land. Eric?
Thank you so much, Dave. I really appreciate it, and it's wonderful to be here today. I wish we could be in person again, but circumstances, of course, have dictated that we're better being separated and doing Zoom our homes or wherever we're working. It's my pleasure to not just kind of start off with a great panel, our events today, but to introduce the 2 panelists who are going to be speaking to you in the first panel. First is Norma Graham. She is the Vice President and Chair of the Cybersecurity and Data Privacy Practice Group at Van Scoy and Associates, or Van Scoy Associates, excuse me. She's a recognized expert in cybersecurity and data privacy. She started one of the first ever cyber practices at an AM law firm, AM 100 law firm in 2005. And I can tell you that it was hard to get people serious about cybersecurity back in 2005. So that's an accomplishment right there. She brings expertise to help defense industrial-based companies and help them understand accepted practices. She was really recently named to Washington Post top list of top outside cybersecurity experts. Norma, thank you for joining us. And I'm now going to introduce Mary Beth Bosco. She's a partner in Holland & Knight's DC office. I have a pleasure, like with Norma, to call her my friend and also my colleague. She has a lot of experience, a few decades of experience practicing government contracts law and cybersecurity compliance. In fact, a significant part of her practice is compliance, especially in cybersecurity. She works on protests, internal investigations, congressional investigations. She's a regular writer and speaker on cybersecurity matters. And of course, my name is Eric Crucis. I'm also a partner at Holland & Knight in the Tyson's, Virginia office. And like Mary Beth, I'm a government contracts and litigation attorney. So thank you all for joining us. And we have a lot of ground to cover and not a lot of time to do it. So I'm going to dive right in to the content that we have today. In our preparation session, Norma, you mentioned you have some kind of breaking news or information that you heard about the memorandum of understanding between the accreditation board and DoD. So I was wondering if you could chat about that for a minute.
Sure. And first of all, thank you to everyone joining us today at home. We know that there are many challenges as you deal with the COVID just in your life and your family, and we're grateful that you're able to participate with us today. You know, one of the things I think that is important, and then I'll jump to the DoD piece, is we talk about the impacts of the pandemic and cybersecurity. It really is all about businesses having a business plan and how it impacts all of us. And as Dave said, when we started this event, even just having bandwidth issues for this event as we try and talk about hot topics you can keep your business going are things that we care about. So I don't want to steal Katie's Arrington, who will be after us, but we see great news that Ellen Lord had signed the MOU with the accreditation board last week. The accreditation board, and we'll hear from them later today, actually approved that. So we're happy to see that that process is going to be moving forward. We also know that just 2 days after the last event in January, the CMMC did put out their updated guidance as to what would be expected for companies. And even last week, there was just a quick update on that as well. So the CMMC is very active and is moving forward. I know we're really focused on how DoD will be implementing the CMMC, and that really means what contracts will be impacted this year. There's about 10 Pathfinder contracts that they'll be looking at, and there really is just a tremendous amount going on. Even as the Congress focuses on the pandemic, and we'll talk more about this later, supply chain issues, cybersecurity issues, funds for DoD, funds for the Homeland Security, and all continue to flow. And what's really important, and we'll spend more time on later, is the cross-reference between companies who are both DIB companies and what we call critical infrastructure. Now, the Homeland Security is calling essential critical infrastructure workers, all tie in if there's a pandemic or traditional cybersecurity issues. So a lot going on. Let me stop there and hand it back to you.
Great, Norma. That's a great introduction. I think it would be helpful to kind of get a lay of the land on what the current requirements are for DoD contractors. And Mary Beth, I know in your vast experience in this area, you have experience helping contractors through those issues and what they need to comply with. So I was wondering if you could talk about, at least for DoD contractors to start, and then we'll move on to non-DoD contractors, what requirements they have right now.
Sure, thank you, Eric. One of the questions we hear all the time from our clients is, as they're rolling out CMMC, what should we be doing? And the answer is comply with the DFARS clause C12. And that means for DoD contractors, there are 3 basic requirements. You've got to, your system have to be compliant with NIST publication 800-171. You should have a system security plan in place, and to the extent you are not compliant with requirements of 800-171, you should have a plan of action for getting there. You need to also flow these clauses down to your subs. And finally, the probably largest or most controversial at the beginning requirement is that you are to report a breach within 72 hours of the occurrence. So those are the current DoD requirements. And just to pick up on something Norma said, how COVID and cyber relate. I know a lot of our government contracts are asking us about if they're going to be able to recover the extra costs that they've incurred during the shutdown, basically. And one of the things we're telling is, if you want a chance of recovery, make sure you are cyber compliant, because given the fact that we're all working from home, the first things the government's going to take a look at when they evaluate your claims for your extra cost caused by the pandemic. And I'll turn it back to Eric.
Great, thank you, Mary Beth. And do you find, you mentioned the DoD clause. I've heard from clients and the compliance with 800-171 in the DoD clause. I've heard from some clients, one of the more difficult things to comply with, and that is the creation of a system security plan. I was wondering if you could just kind of give a brief overview of the idea behind a system security plan and and what contractors should be thinking about with that?
Sure. It's really the heart of your program. So again, this is advice we give clients all the time, and they laugh at us and say, you know, easier said than done, but you should know where the data that is government data, whether it be DoD or a civilian agency, resides in your system. So the first thing that's in a system security plan is a map of your of your IP systems, your IT systems, and where and how they connect to the outside world. If you know where government information resides on your system, it makes it a much easier when there's a suspected breach to understand whether or not the breach affected government information. The second large part of the SSP is of the NIST 181, 171, excuse me, 800, 171 requirements to what you do. And again, to the extent that you do not comply with 800, 171, a plan, a schedule, assignments, who's going to do it, get you up to speed. So those are the two main components where everything is located in your system. If you can possibly wall off or keep separately DoD data, that makes it much easier. And also a mapping 800, 171.
Eric.
Yep.
Just one point to build on, based on how Mary Beth talked about these issues. You know, these are critical issues, but I think what is important for the DIB world and just people who are worrying about how to address CMMC, the concepts that Mary Beth was talking about are critical, and they've honestly been around in the marketplace for our sectors for about 10 years. If in the banking industry, this started many years ago, the concept of knowing where's your data, what is it connected to, what does it mean, and how do you protect it, are really very foundational issues. And I know that a lot of people are struggling with that, as you and Mary Beth said, but it is important for people to understand that that's a foundation. You know, the Department of Defense and other agencies, and even your customers, are expecting that companies are doing this already. We know it's hard, but it's just critical. It has to be done.
That's a really good point, and you know, I think it seems like the government has said there's really no choice. If you want to do business with us, you have to meet these basic tests, and that's what CMMC is all about. Norma, just let's just stay with you for a minute here, if you don't mind. I know you're very involved in what's going on in Capitol Hill and the executive branch and all the different machinations on cybersecurity initiatives within the government that gets passed on, the recommendations that get passed on to industry. One of those things is the Cyber Solarium Commission. I was wondering if you could talk about what they are and what kind of report they issued in the last couple of weeks.
Sure. Thank you for that. You know, as people think about some of these issues, I know when we talk about mission reports and things, people tend not to take those seriously, but the Congress did create something called the Cyberspace Solarium Commission. The reason that it's important that it includes sitting members of Congress, existing executive branch agencies, including the Department of Defense, TNI, DHS, right, the alphabet soup on the security side. And what they've done is they've issued a report that focuses on some very actionable items. There's 75 recommendations in that report that are really about protecting the United States and what they believe the critical infrastructure needs to do. And when I use that term, infrastructure, that covers all sectors. The defense industrial base is certainly one, but energy, transportation, and others. And many of the companies who are with us today, especially on the IT comm side, you're providing services across all those sectors. So the report does three main things. There's many more, but I'll just go through these and then stop. One, it calls on Congress to codify the definition of critical infrastructure and include language that would remind companies that they have a very specific responsibility to address cyber risk. Two, it actually specifically says that Congress should pass a law that gives direct liability to companies for not managing their cybersecurity risk. If they ship items, products, provide services where there are known cyber vulnerabilities, that there would be direct liability to companies for that. It also calls on the creation of a national cybersecurity certification and labeling authority. Again, for those of you in the IT sort of comm sector, but even much broader, that means there would be a federal government agency that would actually work with companies to put markings on products and services about what type of cybersecurity protections are in them. Now, that is a concept that we have seen in the European Union. But it is something that flows from a number of cybersecurity executive orders from the Trump administration and others about how to manage products and services to demonstrate both to the buyer of the service, whether it's government agency or consumers, what level of cyber protections are in there. And then that way people know what they're buying. And it also could help because ultimately when we worry about the cost of adding cybersecurity protections in, those are more expensive products. But if you can see a product that has a higher level of security and you know it's a little more expensive, certainly the federal government is saying that that's something that they care about and they're willing to pay. And I think so would other commercial customers.
That's great insight. I really appreciate it, Norma. Speaking of the cost of doing business with the federal government, which you kind of mentioned, recently there was a ban on certain Chinese companies doing business with the federal government, or I should say more broadly, providing products and services from certain Chinese companies to the federal government. Mary Beth, just asking, obviously this is something that could increase the cost of doing business with the federal government for contractors who have previously provided these products. But I was wondering if you can kind of give an overview of what that ban looks like and where it stands and what we should expect from it, what contractors should think about.
Sure. Back in, I think, the 2018 National Defense Authorization Act, or NDAA, we started seeing for the first time in the GovCon space the banning or limiting of use of products from specific companies. So 2018 was the Kaspersky ban. The 2019 NDAA Section 889, so you'll often hear this ban referred to as the 889 provision, said that government contractors can't sell to the government goods or services that are a substantial or essential part of what they are selling to the government that comes from either Huawei or ZTE. There's also a provision that talks about video surveillance equipment and adds some companies to that ban. It has been implemented in the FAR 52-205-25 is the clause that implements this. It again says that you can't provide the federal government products or services that include components or products from Huawei or ZTE or their subsidiaries, but it doesn't actually list out or define subsidiaries, which of course is going to make things harder for government contractors. The clause also requires companies to include in their SAM reps and certifications that they are complying with this regulation, and it's only going to get broader. In 2020, the ban, if you will be expanded to mean not just that you can't supply the government with these issues, but you can't even use them in the process of making your whatever services or products you're providing. So they're basically all gone. And Norma may talk about this a little bit in more depth. The NDAA also created something called the Federal Acquisition Security Council, and that council is charged with looking at products made overseas to determine whether there will be more companies added to these types of bans. So in terms of the future, you're going to have to look at your processes overall to see whether these components are in your system, and you're going to have to monitor the FASC website to see whether any other products will be added. If they are added, there will be a FAR clause that specifies which additional companies are banned. Thanks, Eric.
Maybe I think as the video has been a little bit slow as we've talked about, and we're waiting for it to come on. I'm not sure if he can hear us. One of the things I did want to just mention to build on what Mary Beth said is that it was the FY19 NDAA, and that was a good precursor to what I think people have been seeing since then. The White House issued the ICT Executive Order 13873. That really went much broader about working with entities like Huawei, ZTE, and others. The Commerce Department, the Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, has been working on a rulemaking for quite some time to really try and give guidance to companies to understand what does it mean if you're in current contracts with some of the companies or countries of note. It's called the Entity List, to understand, what that means going forward for everyday commerce. There actually have been provisions like this in the law that were about, I'd say, 8 years ago, where for certain types of grants, Commerce Department, NASA, others, that if you were a government contractor, you had to work with the FBI to talk about the types of risks and the protections you have in your supply chain around cybersecurity. And ultimately, I think that's the biggest issue that we're seeing across the board. The FASC, as Mary Beth mentioned, is really an entity that is able to move quicker than the rulemaking will be. And they are looking at all government contracts, whether they are civilian or defense, and evaluating companies who are bidding on RFPs and other things, whether or not that the company itself is safe and secure. They have the ability to ban a company completely from participating in a procurement procedure, or even just from one particular one. So I think that there is a lot going on in the executive branch to try and look at these broader issues around countries of origin, but substantiated cybersecurity risks, and they all have to go together. But the clarity and transparency for the private sector on what that is and what they should look for is really important. So I'll turn it back to Eric.
Great, thank you so much, Norma. I lost my audio there for a minute, so I'm not sure if you picked up on that. But one thing I wanted to mention is that Katie Arrington, who's speaking a little bit later, I don't know if this came across before, has been deeply involved in this issue, so she may say a couple of things about it as well. So we look forward to really her comments on that. I want to come back on what contractors should look at, Mary Beth, as far as the non-DoD contractors. We talked about the DFARS clause and what that requires, but the non-DoD contractors have had somewhat more lax requirements to date. And I was wondering if you could just kind of speak to what those requirements are.
Sure. I think DoD, rightly so, has gotten all of the attention in terms of cyber requirements because they've been leading the league, if you will, with very specific requirements. But don't ignore your other civilian contracts, because many agencies have their own cyber requirements. The FAR, there is a FAR section on cyber, but it is not as detailed as DoD. It's really a performance spec. It just requires you, for example, to limit access to information to those who need it, just those who need it, but it doesn't tell you how to do that. It leaves that up to you. Probably, and Katie can probably talk about this a little bit more, when we're talking about CMC level 1, it's closer to the FAR than it certainly is to the DFAR current requirements, which will probably make up most of level 3 on the CMMC. But other agencies have their own requirements as well, and it's very important that you check your tracks. For example, the Department of Transportation and State require companies to notify those agencies when an employee who was working on state or transportation contracts and have access to their IT systems either leave the company or join the company. That's very different than any other requirement. If there are requirements for self-certification or third-party certification, one agency has that in place already. That's HHS. The IRS has an extremely stringent notification requirement. It's 1 hour from a suspected breach that you've got to notify the agency. There are draft DHS, Department of Homeland Security regulations that have not yet become final. And GSA also has draft regulations. So it's quite in a state of flux, but I think what you can expect as CMMC rolls out at DoD, that the FAR Council and the civilian agencies will probably lag along, but eventually follow a very similar model.
This is Katie Arrington. Can I chime in there for a second?
Sure. Thank you.
Hey, so everybody, just in case, just to reference that, I sit on the FASC Council. I'm one of the 3, OMB is the chair. We have the 3 sub-chairs, that's DNI, DHS, and DOD. And one of the charters of the Federal Acquisition Security Council, which derived from the Secure Technology Act that was passed in 2018, actually signed into law December 20th, 2018. And this is to unify, our supply chain. That's a big one, right? And 889 is a part of that. There's, what we have in the DoD, we have special authorities, U.S. Code 10.2339 Alpha, which lets us, when you mentioned Kaspersky, that's how that happened. But the one main part of that is to unify those standards. So you can absolutely expect that federal agencies are going to letting us with the CMMC lead the charge, but they are absolutely looking to adopt the CMMC model as their own, as well as our international partners. And the one last thing I wanted to add, and Mary Beth, you were spot on, and Nicole, and 9B, to those people that are listening today, is probably more impact.
Did we lose Katie there for a minute? Oh, there we go.
Nope. The 889B is more important right now to businesses in the DoD environment than anything. If we do not get something moving on this quickly, it means that the Department of Defense can't contract with anybody who has Huawei, ZTE, or Height Vision in their work. So we really need, we have an industry day, a listening session in the beginning of March, but we would absolutely, please, if you're on this call and you belong to any of the tribe associations, NDIA, AIA, PSC, reach out to make sure that your voice is heard with the legislators, that we need to have a plan in place to do this, because we don't want to hurt our small business partners nor our defense industrial base with the current way those DNB is laid out.
Great, thank you, Katie. That's very helpful. And please feel free to speak to that a little bit also in the next session as well. I think that's really great information, and really appreciate it. One thing I think that people struggle with, and I'm going to come back to you, Mary Beth, before we go to Norma for another question, but is this, and we already got a question about it actually today, is this 72-hour window of breach reporting. And I think some people are struggling with the fact that the DFARS clause and CMMC are 2 separate requirements that layer on top of each other. So I was wondering if you could just kind of talk to that, your expectation that the DFARS clause will be sticking around even though CMMC is here because they have different requirements.
Actually,
sure, absolutely.
Well, Norma, can we are actually in the process of the rule change. DFAR will actually speak directly to the CMMC. And that ruling is already in process and will become normal in of 2020, where the DFAR rule now says you'll be compliant to the NIST standard. It will actually say to the CMMC standard in your contract. And the rule updates, I believe we have to have the CMMC in all DoD contracts by FY25.
Great, and then that rule will still have that 72-hour requirement in it, I presume, or something similar.
Yes.
Eric?
No, Norma, I wanted to come back to you really briefly. And I'm sorry, there's a little bit of a lag, so if I'm talking over somebody. Norma, you came back from speaking at Davos a little while ago. Just kind of from a general sense, what do you see the international community looking at in the cybersecurity world? And what are other areas of the world speaking about? Before, of course, we got swamped with the pandemic. This was obviously something in the front of everyone's mind, and it still is. But what are you hearing around the world on cybersecurity compliance internationally?
Thank you for that. It's actually hard to imagine that was only 2 months ago. It really feels like 10 years ago based on everything that we've been going through. But I'd say 3 main important things that we spent a lot of time talking about at Davos around cybersecurity. And these are changes that I've seen just in doing this for 15 plus years. The first is that we're really seeing both leaders of countries around the world and key sectors talking about the nexus of cyber risk and digital innovation, right? For many years, we've had a very split discussion between cyber risk, which is something that somebody else was supposed to pay attention to, but digital innovation and technological revolutions were things that were cool and interesting, but they didn't need to go together. The second is that when we talk about cybersecurity risk around the world, public or private sectors, it's still in the top 10 risks for both level of severity, nearness of the potential, and the broader impact. And really the third issue, which as you mentioned in the beginning, when I started my practice in 2005, I keep evangelizing, we've been talking about the potential for a widespread cybersecurity attack that could impact critical infrastructure overall. And honestly, even just today, as we're dealing with being at home and the pandemic, just the challenges of basic bandwidth, IT, communication structures, are things that we all need to pay attention to, and the international community is seeing. Now, the last piece, while the U.S. has been working its way mostly sector by sector on cybersecurity issues, mandates, regulatory structures, public-private partnerships, most of the other countries around the world are starting to move to a regulatory structure, that there's a question as to whether or not voluntary compliance is sufficient if it's for what we call those lifeline sectors. And no one is ever excited about new regulations, but ultimately what we were talking about in Davos and around the world is the need to have the conversation, because we need to talk about potential for standardization across all sectors. I know we're focused on the DoD and the DIB world here in the US, but a lot of the companies who are in the DIB world are performing contracts, in the US and other sectors and around the globe. So what the private sector doesn't need is 55 different mandates. But what we do need to do is help talk about what does that standardization mean. At least at the end of the day, I think people are having a legitimate conversation about risk. And now we have to talk about how do we do it. And for some sectors who haven't seen any mandates for many years, while others have, that's a little bit of a hurry up. And I know that will be painful for people. But that's on the global stage, that's what they're seeing. I promise one last thing. The U.S. has been doing a really good job about trying, when they're negotiating bilateral and multilateral agreements, to be including cybersecurity issues or IP protections, trying to push against the requirement for other countries, law enforcement, who have been pushing with law enforcement to be able to get into U.S. companies' networks, IP protections. So I think we're trying to see, and hopefully that will help as we think about what could happen around the world.
Great, that's a wonderful overview. We're actually getting quite a bit of questions, as you could probably imagine. I think some of those can be solved by kind of giving an overview. This is obviously about, the next few hours are about CMMC, but we think it's very helpful to kind of give an overview of what's out there. Mary Beth, I was wondering if you could kind of just give an overview of what CMMC is, about the 5 different levels, and just kind of a general few minutes on what people should expect with CMMC.
Sure, thanks, Eric. This will be brief, and then Katie in the next segment will delve into the details. But again, what this is about is trying to make uniform and subtle requirements imposed on DoD contractors, but also recognize that there are different activities going on, and some warrant more cyber protections than others. So what the basic structure of this program is that there are going to be 5 levels of cybersecurity, starting from 1 going up to 5, which is the most stringent. Level 3, as I said, will probably be very similar to the current 800-171 requirements. Most contracts will fall within level 3. The 4 and 5 levels will have additional requirements to those of 800-171, and will require more oversight from companies, and also more robust policies and procedures, in the sense that they are just institutional, repeatable, across the board, across an organization structure, all offices, etc., uniform, to a certain extent, centralized, predictable, and capable of being carried out and repeated. The other thing you will hear about with CMMC is the fact that your company will need to have a third-party certification that states that your system complies with, let's say, level 3, in order to be awarded a contract that's designated as level 3. So I think by 2025, the goal is that all new DoD contracts coming out will be designated level 1 through 5. And that in order to be awarded the contract, you have to have a third-party certification that says you meet the requirements of that contract. Now, how are you going to get certified? We'll hear about that later as well. There has an accreditation board has been set up. That board will actually set up a program to train third-party certifiers, who will be, for the most part, private entities. Once those companies go through the training, they will be certified, if you will, to do third-party evaluations, and then they'll go out and be able to issue the required level certifications to DoD contractors. I think that's it in a nutshell.
Hey, Eric, I just wanted to add one piece. You know,
Sure.
for a lot of the companies that are watching today or just participating, I know that this is very difficult, and we've talked about this, and we're going to hear a lot more from Katie and the accreditation board as to how DoD plans to do it. But one of the things that I've been spending a fair amount of time on with companies is, if you're a company who are providing services across different sectors who already have very similar regulatory requirements, the better approach I would suggest to make your life easier as a company is to map out the regulatory requirements for the different sectors that you service. So if you're working with the energy industry, there's a number of requirements that have been in place for many years, and these are all almost the same that we're seeing in the DoD CMMC. If you work in the communication sector, if you work in the banking sector, even in transportation now, there's some very similar structures. So instead of everyone has to be compliant, period. No further discussion. And I know Katie will explain that. But in trying to run your business, if you can map out all the requirements across all the places that you're doing business, it's much easier to put a compliance program in place across the company. So you don't need 50 of them. You just need a consistent compliance program that meets the requirements. And honestly, for a lot of companies, you know, small or big, if you're doing it across all sectors, you'll most likely need to pick the most robust requirement and apply it across the board. I know some companies are thinking, I'm going to have a compliance program just for DOT, another just for DOE, just for NERC, just for Treasury, and that's really not a good use of your resources. So, you know, we can talk about that offline, or if companies are interested, but people should be thinking about it that way.
That's a great point. And Norma, I'm going to stay with you just for a minute here because these compliance programs are there to meet bad actors, essentially, who are looking to attack systems, just take things from systems, to alter systems, or just to look at systems. And I always use the analogy that if we didn't know who we were fighting the Nazis in World War II, among others, we wouldn't have done a very good job of fighting World War II. So we have to know who our enemy is. I was wondering if you could talk about kind of who are the significant cyber actors out there that are trying to attack contractors and the American companies writ large.
Sure. Yeah. World War II, we could talk about mutual deterrence in the nuclear age. I grew up in Connecticut, and they taught us to actually hide under our desks in the event that there would be a nuclear attack. I'm not sure that that would have helped us much. But for all companies, I think the bigger issue is you have to understand that there are a host of different attackers and they want different things, right? That's what Eric was talking about. These are nation states. We've talked a lot about those. They're what we call non-state actors. These are entities within some other countries that are being supported by that government, but plausible deniability if they work with those types of groups. There's hacktivists, and honestly, there's just criminals. There are countries like North Korea who have a very aggressive cybersecurity offensive, and that a lot of times is just to raise money because sanctions are hitting North Korea so hard. So attackers are looking for three things. They want to steal, they want to disrupt, and sometimes they want to destroy. Now, we haven't yet hit really that third category a lot in the US, and for that we are very thankful. But I think it's important for people to understand that from where you sit, you are an entity that's being attacked as we speak. And a comment I've heard from a lot of companies as we deal with their cyber risk is, the Russians don't care about my company. Well, I guess the good news for you is you're important enough that they do care. And whether or not they want to attack you personally or they want to get through your networks to other companies or to government, I think that that's really a big issue. There are some very sophisticated groups, and all they do all day long is attack the same sectors over and over. And really, I think the point of a lot of the CMMC and some of the other requirements, and even, cybersecurity information sharing, that's something across sectors that people really need to do. The point is that the attackers are using what we call the same tools, techniques, and procedures to attack everyone. The last thing that is really important that the attackers know, which we'd all strongly suggest that you deal with, they know how quickly you're updating your systems. They know if it takes 2 weeks, 2 months, or 6 months. And what they're doing is they're sitting in your networks right now while they know. You may think that making those updates is something you can do tomorrow or next week, but as soon as you are aware of a vulnerability, you really need to update your systems. Supply chain is really the last thing, and I know we talk a lot about that. Really, attackers are getting into your vendors, whether they're products or services, and you need to be very careful there. So at the end of the day, no one is safe. We don't say that to scare people. It just means we need to take the risk seriously. And, as Mary Beth and Eric and the rest of the team will talk about, really the goal of some of these requirements is to make everyone safer. And we can only do that together. That's a shared responsibility.
Great. And we do have a minute left. So Mary Beth, I just want to ask you one last thing before we have to go. One thing that is interesting that Norma mentioned is the fact that it doesn't matter kind of how small you are, how unimportant you feel. This is an issue where the cyber attackers are kind of looking out for you. And I wonder if you could kind of speak to, so a lot of times those smaller companies are subcontractors in the supply chain, and they're a few levels down. I wonder if you could speak to how, do subcontractors have to comply with the current DoD requirements, and will they have to be CMMC certified as well to do business up the supply chain with DoD?
The answer, Eric, to both questions is yes. Small businesses are not exempt either from the current DoD scheme or regulations, and they will not be exempt from CMMC going forward. As subcontractors, the extent to which they are covered may depend on the type of information that they have access to through their prime. So the prime contractors can assist small business contractors greatly if they are careful about separating out covered defense information. If the subs don't need it, don't give it to them. make things easier. Rightfully, small businesses are worried about the cost. DoD has said that they're going to pay for companies to upgrade their systems. And there are other ways, none of which are perfect, that some small businesses have been dealing with their primes to make sure that they are following the right cyber standards. So for example, some prime contractors will load a laptop that is only connected to the prime contractor's system. And therefore the information on the prime's system always stays with the prime, it never goes to the subcontractor. And there are variations on that theme. Can the subs send their workers to the prime's facilities, et cetera? But I think it is important for the subs, no matter how small, to not be a weak link in this chain. While it happened to a large business, I think one of the scariest things to me is a few years back, one of the largest breaches that had occurred so far in the US, the bad actor came in through the HVAC system of the company. And I think that opened a lot of eyes about how vulnerable systems can be on all levels.
Great. Well, thank you, Mary Beth. Thank you, Norma. With that, we are out of time. I still have half my questions left to ask, but unfortunately, we have very exciting material to come up, and Katie Arrington's up next. But before that, I know we're going to send it over to Dave Gardy to take us out.
Thank you, Eric. Great panel. Thank you for both Mary Beth, also Norma and Eric. Did a great job there. We're going to go to Katie Arrington shortly, but before we do, we're going to go to a brief commercial sponsor from Tom Tollerton.
I cannot hear Dave.
Of DHG.
No, I can't either.